On a desolate stretch of dirt road, hidden beneath a canopy of pines, the quiet of a late winter night was shattered by a blinding flashlight. It was February 1946, and a secluded lover's lane on the edge of Texarkana was about to become the birthplace of an enduring American nightmare. The sudden glare cutting through the darkness was not the beam of a patrolling officer checking on parked cars. It was the calculated approach of a predator. Two young people, seeking nothing more than privacy, found themselves staring into the void of a white cloth mask with cut-out eye holes. The assailant forced Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae from their vehicle at gunpoint, his voice a calm, chilling command in the frigid air. The brutality that followed was methodical and terrifyingly silent. An eruption of violence that left both victims battered and deeply traumatized, though miraculously alive. The attacker vanished into the dense woods as swiftly as he had appeared, leaving behind no footprints, no dropped weapon, and no discernible motive. The shadows simply swallowed him whole. In the immediate aftermath, the twin cities of Texarkana, straddling the border of Texas and Arkansas, treated the assault as an isolated, albeit vicious, anomaly. The post-war boom had brought a sense of triumphant security to the nation, and this tight-knit community was no exception. Residents left their doors unlocked. Teenagers freely roamed the rural outskirts after dark. The concept of a randomized, serial attacker stalking the rural backroads was entirely foreign, an unspeakable horror that belonged in pulp magazines, not in their own backyards. That fragile illusion of safety shattered permanently exactly 4 weeks later on another secluded lover's lane. Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were discovered dead in their parked sedan, the vehicle abandoned at the end of a rural road. The crime scene was a tableau of absolute devastation, bearing the unmistakable signature of the same masked figure. The killer had escalated from brutal assault to double homicide, executing his victims with a .32 caliber pistol and leaving them positioned with a disturbing cold precision. Investigators arriving at the rain-soaked scene faced a grim reality regarding the limitations of mid-20th century forensics. In 1946, crime scene preservation was rudimentary at best, and the downpour had already washed away crucial tire tracks and footprints. There was no DNA profiling, no advanced blood spatter analysis, and no digital footprints to track. Law enforcement had to rely entirely on ballistics, witness testimony, and the painstaking manual collection of circumstantial evidence. The lack of physical evidence forced local authorities into a desperate game of catch-up against an adversary who seemed to anticipate their every move. The phantom-like nature of the killer meant detectives were chasing smoke. Every lead they pursued dissolved upon closer inspection. Every suspect they interrogated possessed an ironclad alibi. The local police force, unaccustomed to such complex randomized violence, quickly realized they were outmatched by the sheer unpredictability of the perpetrator. This unpredictability pointed to a deeply disturbed yet highly organized psychological profile. The attacker demonstrated a terrifying spatial awareness, utilizing the rural geography of the region to his advantage. He stalked locations where victims were isolated and vulnerable, striking with overwhelming force before melting back into the rural landscape. This was not a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong, but a sequence of calculated hunts driven by a dark internal compulsion. As the realization set in that a serial murderer was actively hunting in their midst, a suffocating panic gripped Texarkana. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts, window locks, and ammunition within hours. Curfews were strictly enforced, and armed citizens began patrolling their own neighborhoods. The sun setting each evening was no longer a signal for rest, but the beginning of a town-wide vigil against an invisible terror. The phantom killer had successfully held an entire region hostage without ever showing his face. The moonlight brought no reprieve, only another devastating strike in mid-April. Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker, a high school saxophonist who had just finished performing at a local dance, were found murdered in a local park. The brutality had intensified. The crime scene spread across a wider area, indicating a prolonged and agonizing pursuit. The killer was growing bolder, more confident in his ability to evade capture, and seemingly taunting the very authorities sworn to stop him. The sheer escalation of violence prompted the arrival of the legendary Texas Rangers, led by the formidable Captain M.T. Gonzalez. Known as the Lone Wolf, Gonzalez brought a structured, aggressive approach to the flailing investigation, famously declaring to the press that the killer would be caught or killed. He established a heavily fortified command center, coordinated massive sweeps of the surrounding counties, and initiated a sophisticated public relations campaign to calm the terrified populace. The investigation transformed from a local police matter into a statewide military operation. Despite the influx of manpower and resources, the Rangers encountered the same impenetrable wall of silence. They set up decoy cars on remote roads, placing heavily armed officers in the front seats of parked vehicles, hoping to draw the attacker out of the shadows. Roadblocks were erected on every major highway leading out of the city, yet the killer seemed to possess a supernatural awareness of the traps being laid for him, consistently striking where the police were not. The pattern of Lover's Lane attacks abruptly shifted in early May, introducing a terrifying new dimension to the cold case. The killer bypassed the secluded roads and attacked an isolated farmhouse, shooting Virgil Starks through his closed living room window before pursuing his wife, Katie, through the home. This brazen home invasion shattered the established victimology. The predator was no longer confined to the dark edges of town. He was now crossing the threshold into the supposed sanctuary of the home. This sudden deviation in the modus operandi deeply troubled behavioral analysts and investigators alike. An organized killer typically refines their method, perfecting the specific ritual that satisfies their psychological urges. To abandon the secluded roads for a high-risk home invasion suggested either an escalating frenzy, a desperate loss of control, or a calculated misdirection intended to confuse the massive dragnet closing in around him. The psychological profile was suddenly fractured, leaving the Rangers grasping at contradictory theories. Amidst the chaos and shifting profiles, one name consistently floated to the surface of the suspect pool: U.L. Swinney. A career petty criminal with a history of car theft and a reputation for violence, Swinney possessed the localized knowledge necessary to navigate the backroads of the region. His own wife provided a damning, albeit inconsistent, confession to authorities, stating she had accompanied him on the nights of the murders and watched him disappear into the woods with a gun. The circumstantial case against Swinney was compelling, yet fraught with legal peril. His wife's testimony, the cornerstone of the investigation against him, was legally inadmissible in court unless she chose to testify, which she ultimately refused to do. Furthermore, her accounts frequently changed, tainted by coercion and her own fragile mental state. The physical evidence tying Swinney directly to the murders remained non-existent. He was a perfect suspect trapped in an imperfect legal reality. Unable to secure a murder indictment without a confession or forensic proof, prosecutors pivoted to a different strategy. They charged Swinney with a separate, unrelated crime of auto theft, aggressively prosecuting him as a habitual offender. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The authorities quietly celebrated, convinced they had removed the phantom from the streets, even if they could never officially pin the Moonlight Murders on him. With Swinney incarcerated, the attacks abruptly ceased, leaving a haunting silence in their wake. The town slowly exhaled, unbolting their doors and returning to a semblance of normalcy. Yet the lack of a definitive resolution left a permanent scar on the collective psyche of the community. The official files remained open, the questions unanswered. If Swinney was indeed the masked man, he took his secrets to the grave, denying the victims' families the closure of a formal conviction. The possibility that the true killer simply moved on, or died, or was imprisoned for another crime remains a chilling alternative. Serial predators rarely stop voluntarily unless physically incapacitated. If the assailant was not the car thief locked away in a Texas penitentiary, then a highly organized, deeply sadistic murderer simply vanished into the ether of post-war America. This horrifying prospect transforms the narrative from a solved crime by proxy into an enduring, terrifying mystery. Decades later, modern cold case investigators reviewing the yellowed files face the same frustrating dead ends. The physical evidence collected in 1946 has largely been lost, degraded, or contaminated beyond the reach of modern DNA extraction techniques. The original suspect pool has long since passed away. The case file is a tragic monument to the era before forensic science could speak for the dead. The silent witnesses of the crime scenes, the shell casings, the tire tracks, the positioning of the bodies, remain mute. The legend of the Phantom Killer eventually transcended the specific tragedies of the victims, morphing into a dark piece of American folklore. The unsolved nature of the crimes inspired urban legends, campfire stories, and eventually, a loosely adapted horror film that further blurred the lines between historical fact and sensationalized fiction. The true horror of the events was slowly eclipsed by the mythos of the masked boogeyman, a disservice to the very real lives extinguished on those lonely dirt roads. Beneath the folklore lies the profound, generational trauma inflicted upon the families of the victims. For them, the Phantom was not a ghost story, but the architect of their darkest reality. The empty chairs at dinner tables, the unfulfilled potential of young lives cut violently short, and the agonizing lack of justice created a void that time could never fully heal. The tragedy was compounded by the perpetual uncertainty, the agonizing knowledge that the killer likely walked free. The shadow of the Texas Rangers' massive yet ultimately fruitless manhunt still looms large over the study of historical serial crimes. It serves as a stark reminder that sheer force and manpower cannot always compensate for a lack of forensic technology and behavioral understanding. The investigation was a product of its time, a collision between traditional law enforcement tactics and a new, incomprehensible breed of randomized violence that defied all conventional logic. The Phantom Killer represents the terrifying archetype of the anonymous predator. By concealing his face and striking seemingly at random, he stripped away the comforting illusion that violence is always predictable or connected to the victim's social circle. He proved that darkness could manifest without warning, without motive, and without a face. This psychological terror was his most potent weapon, a legacy of fear that outlasted his brief, bloody reign. Today, the rural roads of Texarkana have changed. The dirt paths are paved, the dense woods pushed back by urban sprawl. Yet, the atmosphere of those lovers' lanes still carries the heavy weight of history. The whispers of that unsolved case still echo through the community, a persistent reminder of the fragility of safety. The moonlight, once a symbol of romance for the youth of a post-war town, remains forever stained by the memory of the violence it illuminated. The Texarkana Moonlight Murders endure as one of the most chilling unsolved chapters in American criminal history. The Phantom Killer remains a mystery not merely because of lost evidence or the limitations of the era, but because he embodies the ultimate, terrifying unknown. He is the shadow just beyond the reach of the flashlight, the silent footstep in the woods, and the enduring proof that sometimes the monsters are real, and sometimes they simply vanish into the dark.